cash, weapons. We seized the Mercedes-Benz, estimated over at $15 million. We seized dozens of motorcycles worth approximately $40 million. And other valuable artwork and jewelry.
From Olympic slopes to international manhunts, Ryan Wedding's fall was neither subtle nor brief. Federal investigators say the former Canadian snowboarder left behind a trail of abandoned mansions, seized supercars, and frozen assets tied to one of the largest cocaine pipelines in modern history, an empire worth billions now stripped bare and catalogued. The Olympian who became a ghost.
He is a modern-day El Chapo. He is a modern-day Pablo Escobar.
Ryan James Wedding entered public life as a national symbol. He represented Canada at the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, competing in parallel giant slalom snowboarding, finishing 24th, an unremarkable placement that still placed him among the world's elite athletes. Olympic participation, by definition, confers legitimacy, discipline, and public trust. Wedding received all three, briefly, before discarding them.
As we announce the arrest of Ryan James Wedding, this has been a coordinated, intelligence-driven investigation into Wedding's global drug trafficking organization.
Federal authorities now allege that the same individual who once wore his country's flag later constructed a transnational narcotics enterprise capable of moving approximately 60 metric tons of cocaine across international borders, primarily from Colombia through Mexico into the United States and Canada, using Southern California as a logistical choke point. The FBI has described the scale of this operation as comparable to historic cartel leadership, a comparison made publicly during Wedding's arrest announcement. He went from an Olympic snowboarder to the largest narco-trafficker in modern times. That comparison was not rhetorical. According to law enforcement, the operation attributed to Wedding generated billions in downstream street value, funded fortified properties across multiple jurisdictions, and relied on cartel-level violence to maintain discipline and operational silence. Investigators did not describe a lifestyle criminal. They described an executive. The transformation did not occur overnight. Wedding's athletic career ended quietly. There were no farewell ceremonies, no endorsement deals, no public collapse. What followed was an absence, an athlete exiting the highly structured world of elite competition into a civilian life, offering significantly less clarity, income, or protection. Former teammates described no warning signs. Ross Rebagliati, Olympic gold medalist and training peer, stated publicly that Wedding appeared disciplined, supported, and focused during his competitive years.
Were there any clues that he was capable of allegedly doing this?
No clues at all. You know what, to be honest, this guy, when I first met him, like I'm 10 years older than him, he was 18 or 19. He was like your all-American athlete, you know, like over 6 feet tall, completely ripped, and just charged the course. And, you know, he had great family support.
That assessment remains consistent across interviews. Wedding was not described as reckless, volatile, or desperate. He was described as quiet, physically dominant, and internally driven, traits that translate efficiently outside sport when paired with opportunity and criminal infrastructure. By 2009, that translation had occurred. Wedding was convicted in the United States on charges related to conspiracy to distribute cocaine. He received a 4-year sentence. The conviction should have ended the story. Instead, it marked the beginning of its most consequential chapter. Wedding was released in 2011. Federal authorities allege that rather than disengaging from narcotics trafficking, he escalated. According to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, Wedding used contacts formed before and during incarceration to construct a vertically integrated distribution network operating at cartel scale. After his release, authorities say he built a transnational drug organization. This network required capital, storage, laundering mechanisms, and above all, secure locations. That requirement produced the physical artifacts now central to this investigation: large, fortified luxury properties, mansions acquired, occupied, and abandoned as operational needs shifted. Federal agents later described these properties not as residences, but as infrastructure. Surveillance systems, reinforced access points, secure rooms, layered exits, and controlled perimeters appeared repeatedly across seized locations. The architectural choices reflected threat modeling, not comfort. Law enforcement detailed these features during the arrest press conference. The contents reinforced that assessment. Investigators seized over $55 million in illicit assets tied directly to Wedding's organization, including high-value vehicles, motorcycles, artwork, jewelry, and cash reserves. That figure represents only what authorities physically recovered. Over $55 million in illicit assets were seized. Those assets were distributed across multiple jurisdictions. Some properties were left mid-use, their contents intact, suggesting rapid abandonment. Others appeared curated, staged to resemble legitimate wealth. None remained occupied once enforcement pressure intensified. The abandoned mansions became silent records of escalation. They reflected a progression from concealment to confidence. Early properties favored discretion. Later acquisitions emphasized scale, isolation, and control, attributes consistent with individuals who no longer believe anonymity is necessary. Federal investigators alleged that this confidence was enforced through violence. According to indictments, Wedding ordered or authorized multiple killings, including the murder of a federal witness. Officials have declined to release victim identities, citing ongoing proceedings and security concerns. Authorities allege he orchestrated multiple murders, including of a government witness.
Our collective efforts led to the seizure of more than 2,300 kilograms of cocaine, 44 kilograms of methamphetamine, 44 kilograms of fentanyl, 8 firearms, and over $55 million in illicit assets.
This allegation fundamentally reframed the case. Wedding was no longer pursued solely as a trafficker. He was pursued as an organizer, willing to remove legal obstacles permanently. That distinction triggered international prioritization. The FBI placed Wedding on its top 10 most wanted list. The US State Department authorized a multi-million-dollar reward for information leading to his capture. The Treasury Department sanctioned 19 individuals connected to the organization, freezing assets and blocking financial access. The Treasury sanctioned 19 individuals linked to the network. These actions had predictable consequences. Wedding vanished. He abandoned fixed residences. He shifted between jurisdictions with established cartel influence. He relied on intermediaries. He left behind properties that could no longer be secured without exposing his location. The mansions became liabilities, too large, too documented, too visible. Law enforcement agencies across the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Colombia coordinated intelligence under a joint task force framework. The operation was formally named Operation Giant Slalom, an ironic reference to Wedding's Olympic discipline. Operation name confirmed during FBI briefing. The irony was intentional. Federal officials acknowledged it publicly. The pursuit of a former Olympian across cartel corridors carried symbolic weight. It also carried logistical complexity. During this period, authorities seized more than 2,300 kilograms of cocaine, 44 kilograms each of methamphetamine and fentanyl, and multiple firearms tied to the network. Seizure figures released by LAPD and FBI. The fentanyl quantity alone represented a lethal capacity measured in tens of thousands of lives. Investigators noted that diversification into synthetic opioids suggested profit optimization over risk mitigation, an indicator of organizational maturity and moral vacancy. Throughout this escalation, the abandoned mansions remained: empty garages, secured rooms, asset catalogs taped to evidence bags. These properties were no longer symbols of success. They were frozen moments, physical snapshots of an empire built faster than it could be defended. Ryan Wedding, meanwhile, remained absent. That absence would not last. The mansions attributed to Wedding's network were not acquired as vanity purchases. Investigators emphasized this distinction repeatedly. These were not celebrity homes designed for visibility or leisure. They were operational assets, selected for geography, jurisdictional friction, and physical defensibility. Federal affidavits describe properties positioned near transportation corridors, private airstrips, coastal access points, and rural buffer zones that reduced law enforcement response times. Authorities described the properties as strategic locations, not residences. This operational framing matters because it explains why the homes were abandoned so abruptly. When enforcement pressure increased, the cost-benefit calculation shifted. A mansion with surveillance logs, utility records, and local staff becomes a liability once a fugitive threshold is crossed. Wedding's disappearance required subtraction, not accumulation. Former federal prosecutors interviewed by NBC News explained that high-level traffickers often discard real estate faster than vehicles or cash because property leaves an administrative footprint that cannot be erased. Real estate becomes a roadmap for investigators. That roadmap was extensive. Public records show that multiple properties linked to Wedding or his proxies were registered through layered shell companies, nominee owners, and foreign trusts. These structures delayed attribution but did not prevent it. Once one node collapsed, the rest followed. NBC News detailed the use of shell entities tied to Wedding's assets. Investigators described a familiar pattern: identical interior modifications across different homes, reinforced doors, secondary exits, concealed rooms, commercial-grade communication equipment. The repetition suggested standardized build-outs rather than personal preference. In other words, these mansions were interchangeable. The abandonment itself was forensic evidence. Some properties still contained unopened luxury furnishings. Others had refrigerators stocked, beds made, vehicles parked but unused. This indicated sudden departure rather than gradual relocation. Federal agents interpreted this as confirmation that Wedding received actionable intelligence warning of imminent exposure. Law enforcement noted rapid abandonment during the press briefing. Such warnings typically come from compromised networks. Investigators believe Wedding's scale made internal leaks inevitable. A 60 metric ton operation requires hundreds of participants across borders. Control erodes as volume increases. Violence compensates temporarily. Eventually, intelligence escapes. That erosion coincided with Wedding's elevation onto international priority lists. Once designated as a top 10 most wanted fugitive, any static location became untenable. Local protection networks cannot shield against coordinated federal and international pursuit indefinitely. The mansions, regardless of cost, lost their utility. The financial scale attributed to Wedding, often framed as $10 billion, requires clarification. Authorities have not claimed that Wedding personally held $10 billion in liquid assets. Instead, the figure represents aggregate street value of narcotics moved through the organization over time, combined with seized assets, disrupted shipments, and projected revenue streams. Officials clarified that the valuation reflects total enterprise impact, not personal net worth. This distinction is routinely ignored in headlines, but central to understanding the abandoned properties. Wedding did not need to personally own $10 billion to justify multi-million-dollar compounds. He needed predictable cash flow, enforceable authority, and confidence that the operation would continue. When that confidence evaporated, so did the logic of permanence. The mansions, then, became artifacts of overextension. Each empty structure marked a moment when expansion outpaced concealment. Investigators often refer to such properties as fossils, static remains of an organization that moved too slowly when pressure accelerated. Canadian authorities, while cooperating with US agencies, emphasized that Wedding's Olympic background amplified public interest, but did not alter investigative priorities. The case was pursued not because of celebrity, but because of lethality. Canadian officials stated the Olympic history was incidental to the prosecution. Still, the contrast proved narratively unavoidable. An athlete trained for precision, discipline, and risk assessment ultimately failed at all three. The mansions, vast, empty, documented, became quiet rebuttals to any mythology of criminal genius. By the time Wedding was captured, many of these properties had already been seized, catalogued, and stripped of value. Others remained abandoned, locked in legal limbo as evidence or forfeiture targets. None functioned as homes. None retained their original purpose. They stood instead as static evidence of a trajectory that only moves in one direction: expansion, exposure, abandonment. And Ryan Wedding, the Olympian who once chased fractions of seconds on snow, was finally outpaced by time itself. The empire of excess. Federal investigators did not describe Ryan Wedding's properties as homes. They described them as infrastructure nodes, physical extensions of a criminal organization engineered for volume, security, and redundancy. Each mansion served a purpose. Each was selected, modified, and ultimately discarded based on operational necessity rather than comfort or aesthetics. This distinction underpins every valuation, seizure, and abandonment tied to Wedding's name. Authorities documented properties across Southern California, Mexico, and intermediary transit regions tied to cartel-controlled corridors. These locations shared consistent characteristics: isolation without remoteness, accessibility without exposure, and luxury without personalization. Real estate analysts assisting federal task forces noted that such properties are designed to blend into high-net-worth environments while remaining functionally hostile to intrusion. Investigators described the properties as fortified operational hubs. Architectural assessments conducted after seizures revealed patterns: high perimeter walls exceeding local norms, redundant surveillance systems operating independently of municipal power grids, internal compartmentalization that allowed portions of a structure to be sealed without alerting occupants elsewhere. These features appeared repeatedly, regardless of country or builder, suggesting standardized design specifications rather than local improvisation. Law enforcement behavioral analysts interpret such uniformity as evidence of centralized command. In other words, these were not autonomous safe houses operated by mid-level actors. They were assets controlled at the highest organizational tier. Analysts confirmed the properties reflected centralized operational control. The scale of expenditure reinforced this conclusion. Individual properties were valued in the tens of millions of dollars. Renovations alone often exceeded the median lifetime earnings of professional athletes. These investments only make sense when amortized across continuous, high-volume revenue streams. Investigators tied those streams to cocaine shipments measured not in kilograms, but in tons. Authorities linked property funding to large-scale cocaine distribution. This is where the $10 billion framing emerges, not as a literal bank balance, but as an aggregate reflection of throughput. Federal agencies estimate that Wedding's organization moved narcotics with a downstream street value approaching $10 billion over multiple years. That valuation incorporates seized shipments, intercepted communications, cooperating witness testimony, and financial modeling based on known distribution routes. Officials explained how enterprise valuations are calculated. The mansions, therefore, were proportional. A network capable of generating billions does not operate out of apartments or short-term rentals. It requires permanence, until permanence becomes visibility. Inside these properties, agents catalogued items that further clarified function: secure counting rooms, industrial packaging materials, encrypted communication devices, firearms stored in multiple locations within the same structure to prevent single-point compromise. The absence of family artifacts, personal photographs, or long-term domestic indicators reinforced the conclusion that these were not lived-in spaces. Evidence inventories confirmed the lack of personal residential indicators. One property seized in Southern California contained vehicles valued in excess of several $1 million, parked but unused. Agents noted that these vehicles had low mileage and no registration records consistent with daily use. They were status assets, symbols of control rather than transportation tools. Law enforcement detailed high-value vehicle seizures. From an investigative standpoint, such excess is informative. It indicates an organization operating beyond immediate survival concerns. Wedding's network had reached a stage where signaling dominance mattered as much as concealment. This stage is historically unstable. Cartel analysts interviewed by US media outlets noted that excessive real estate accumulation often precedes collapse. Properties require maintenance, staffing, utilities, and legal cover. Each requirement introduces exposure. Experts noted that large properties increase investigative risk. The abandonment of these mansions followed a predictable enforcement timeline. As indictments were unsealed and co-conspirators arrested, properties went dark. Utility usage dropped abruptly. Staff disappeared. Surveillance feeds ceased transmitting. In some cases, food spoiled in kitchens untouched for weeks, indicating sudden evacuation rather than planned transition. Investigators interpret such abandonment as confirmation that the organization prioritized leadership extraction over asset preservation. Cash can be moved. Narcotics can be rerouted. Property cannot. The forfeiture process transformed these mansions from symbols of power into evidentiary exhibits. Federal agents photographed every room. Financial analysts traced every payment. Title records were dissected. Shell companies collapsed under scrutiny. The Treasury Department outlined its asset forfeiture strategy. In total, more than $55 million in physical assets were seized directly, with additional properties frozen pending adjudication. Authorities emphasized that this figure represents a fraction of the organization's footprint. This is only what we could physically seize. The remainder exists as absence. Empty structures, unfinished renovations, abandoned compounds quietly degrading under legal seals. These sites now function as negative space, evidence of wealth that once moved too freely to remain hidden. The mansions also became leverage. Prosecutors used property records to pressure lower-level participants. Who paid for renovations? Who authorized staffing? Who accessed restricted rooms? Real estate, in this context, comes testimony. Prosecutors explained how property records support conspiracy charges. Throughout this process, Wedding remained absent. His network fractured under scrutiny. Violence, once used to enforce silence, became counterproductive. Each act increased urgency, coordination, and international cooperation. By the time authorities closed in, the mansions no longer protected him. They identified him. And when investigators finally tracked Ryan Wedding across borders, the empire of excess he built was already hollow. Its most visible symbols reduced to locked doors, evidence tags, and valuation spreadsheets. In the end, the mansions did not testify to success, they testified to scale. And scale, in criminal enterprises, attracts only one outcome. Beyond their physical characteristics, the mansions functioned as financial instruments. Investigators emphasized that large-scale criminal organizations often park revenue in real estate because it offers perceived legitimacy, appreciation, and temporary insulation from volatility. Wedding's network followed this pattern aggressively. Properties were purchased through layered transactions designed to obscure beneficial ownership, often involving foreign nationals, cash-heavy intermediaries, and shell entities registered in secrecy jurisdictions. NBC News detailed how layered ownership structures delayed attribution but failed under scrutiny. These mechanisms were not unique, but their scale was. Financial analysts working with federal agencies described the portfolio as overbuilt, meaning the number and value of properties exceeded what was necessary for operational continuity. This overbuilding signaled confidence bordering on disregard, a stage where leadership assumes enforcement pressure can be managed indefinitely. That assumption rarely survives contact with coordinated federal response. Once Wedding was designated a priority fugitive, real estate exposure accelerated. Subpoenas targeting utility companies, property managers, and private security firms generated timelines that narrowed movement windows. Investigators used electricity usage spikes, water consumption, and maintenance logs to reconstruct occupancy patterns without physical surveillance. Law enforcement described using utility data to map property usage. These methods revealed another pattern. The mansions were rarely used simultaneously. Occupancy rotated. When one location showed activity, others went dormant. This suggested Wedding avoided predictable routines, a tactic consistent with high-level fugitive behavior. However, rotating between fixed assets still leaves a trail. The properties, in effect, became blinking indicators rather than hiding places. The abandonment phase confirmed this vulnerability. Investigators observed that once Wedding crossed into full fugitive status, properties were vacated permanently rather than rotated. No attempts were made to sell or legally divest from them. That decision indicates urgency. Liquidation would have required interaction with financial systems already under scrutiny. Abandonment required only departure. In several cases, authorities found evidence that staff were instructed to leave without explanation. Employment contracts were terminated abruptly. Payments ceased. This created additional witnesses. Individuals with partial knowledge suddenly cut loose and financially exposed. Prosecutors noted that abrupt abandonment often generates cooperating witnesses. From a prosecutorial perspective, the mansions became narrative anchors. Jurors understand houses. They understand gates, cameras, and excess. Explaining a transnational cocaine pipeline can be abstract. Showing photographs of empty compounds with reinforced doors and evidence markers is not. Officials explained how seized properties are used to contextualize scale for juries. The geographic spread of the properties also undermined any argument of isolated wrongdoing. Assets appeared in multiple jurisdictions, tied together by common design elements and financial pathways. This reinforced conspiracy allegations by demonstrating coordination rather than coincidence. Authorities emphasized that none of the mansions were seized in isolation. Each seizure followed arrests, intercepted communications, or financial disclosures that pointed investigators toward physical locations. The properties were endpoints, not starting points. Law enforcement clarified that real estate seizures followed intelligence breakthroughs. This sequencing matters because it dismantles the myth of sudden collapse. Wedding's empire did not fall overnight. It eroded incrementally. Each abandoned mansion marked a lost node, a compromised route, a narrowed option set. By the time the final properties were vacated, the organization was already functionally impaired. Analysts also noted the psychological dimension. Large properties create an illusion of control. High walls and distance from urban centers feel secure. In reality, they concentrate risk. Once identified, they cannot disappear. Experts described large compounds as static targets. The mansion's current status reflects this reality. Some remain under government control pending forfeiture. Others sit empty, legally frozen, deteriorating. Their market value is now theoretical, constrained by stigma, litigation, and evidentiary status. What once symbolized liquidity now represents immobilization. This inversion is central to the story. Wedding's wealth was never meant to be static. It was designed to move through shipments, payments, properties, and proxies. The mansions interrupted that movement. They anchored the enterprise to places that could be watched, traced, and ultimately seized. In that sense, the properties did not merely reflect excess. They accelerated exposure. By the time investigators closed in on Ryan Wedding himself, the empire of excess had already betrayed him. Its most expensive components had become its loudest signals. The abandoned mansions were not just remnants of past success. They were evidence of miscalculation. And miscalculation in enterprises of this scale is terminal. The collapse and the catalogue. Ryan Wedding was arrested without ceremony. There was no compound raid broadcast live, no final standoff inside one of the fortified mansions he once relied on. By the time authorities located him, the infrastructure that defined his power had already been dismantled. What remained was a fugitive with diminishing options, tracked not by glamour or mythology, but by paperwork, financial residue, and the slow collapse of secrecy. Federal officials confirmed that Wedding was captured following a multi-agency effort involving US, Mexican, and Canadian authorities, coordinated through intelligence-sharing frameworks established specifically for high-value transnational fugitives. Authorities confirmed the arrest followed months of international coordination. The arrest itself was anticlimactic by design. Investigators emphasized that high-level targets are often apprehended quietly to minimize risk, prevent collateral violence, and preserve evidence. Wedding was no longer protected by his mansions, his network, or his money. He was protected only by movement, and movement had become predictable. What followed was not spectacle, but inventory. The final phase of large-scale criminal cases rarely focuses on the individual. It focuses on documentation. Prosecutors began assembling what they described as a comprehensive enterprise record, integrating financial ledgers, property records, communications intercepts, and witness testimony into a single evidentiary framework. Prosecutors outlined their enterprise-based approach during post-arrest briefings. The abandoned mansions occupied a central role in this framework. Each property was assigned a case file. Each room was photographed, measured, and cross-referenced. Renovation invoices were matched against financial transfers. Surveillance hardware was traced to suppliers. Utility usage timelines were aligned with known operational events. This process transformed real estate into narrative evidence. The properties told a story of escalation, confidence, and eventual panic. Prosecutors did not need to speculate about intent. The structures themselves demonstrated it. One senior federal official described the mansions as crime scenes without bodies, emphasizing that while the violence occurred elsewhere, the planning, financing, and command infrastructure resided within these walls. Officials described properties as central to operational command. As the legal process advanced, authorities moved to formalize asset forfeiture. This stage often receives less public attention than arrests, but it is where long-term consequences crystallize. Properties tied to criminal proceeds are not returned. They are absorbed, sold, or repurposed. Wealth that once signaled dominance becomes public record. The Treasury Department confirmed that forfeiture actions extended beyond Wedding himself, targeting associates, shell entities, and facilitators who benefited from property transactions tied to the network. The Treasury detailed secondary forfeiture actions linked to the case. This expansion mattered. It ensured that the mansions could not be reclaimed indirectly. Ownership chains were severed, trusts were dissolved, financial insulation collapsed. What had once been a distributed empire condensed into a ledger of seized and frozen assets. The property's fate varied. Some were slated for auction following adjudication. Others remained under seal as evidence. Several were deemed unsuitable for immediate sale due to structural modifications or legal encumbrances. Their market value, once inflated by exclusivity, now depended on disclosure statements detailing their history. Real estate experts noted that properties associated with organized crime often sell at significant discounts, regardless of location or amenities. Stigma is persistent. NBC News reported on the long-term devaluation of seized properties. From a narrative perspective, this devaluation is instructive. The mansions were never stable stores of value. They were tools, misidentified as trophies. Once their utility expired, they offered no protection. Wedding's Olympic history resurfaced repeatedly during coverage of the arrest, but prosecutors minimized its relevance. In court filings and public statements, he was described not as a former athlete, but as an alleged leader of a violent narcotics organization. The past was context, not mitigation. Canadian officials echoed this framing, emphasizing that national pride did not translate into legal leniency. Canadian authorities stated the Olympic background carried no legal weight. As proceedings continued, investigators stressed that the case's significance extended beyond one individual. Wedding's prosecution represented a model for dismantling modern trafficking organizations, target leadership, map infrastructure, freeze assets, and let excess expose itself. The mansions, abandoned and catalogued, became training examples. Federal agencies now use similar property profiles to identify emerging threats. Large fortified residences acquired rapidly through layered ownership structures. Law enforcement confirmed properties are now used as analytical benchmarks. This institutional memory ensures that the story does not end with sentencing. The architecture of Wedding's empire informs future investigations. His mistakes become procedural lessons. In the end, Ryan Wedding's downfall was not defined by a single error. It was defined by accumulation of assets, of confidence, of visibility. The mansions represented the peak of that accumulation. They also marked its limit. Empty, silent, and documented, they now exist as fixed points in an otherwise fluid criminal history. They no longer conceal activity. They reveal it. And that is the final irony. An individual who once measured success in fractions of seconds ultimately lost everything because he could not move fast enough when permanence became exposure. Thanks for watching. To enjoy more of such eye-opening content, please click on the card showing on the screen.